In the late 18th century, the newly formed United States was on the brink of chaos. As hope blossomed in some corners, in others, fear and unrest brewed. The whispers of rebellion echoed through the hills of western Pennsylvania, where farmers, burdened by a harsh new tax on their lifeblood, whiskey, found themselves caught in a storm of desperation. This tax, imposed by a distant government, would ignite a fierce uprising that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the young republic. This is the story of the Whiskey Rebellion, a pivotal moment in American history that illuminates the struggles between governance, taxation, and the enduring quest for liberty. In the 1790s, whiskey was more than just a beverage. It was a vital part of life on the American frontier. For many farmers, particularly in western Pennsylvania, whiskey served as a form of currency. It was easier to transport than grain and provided essential income, especially for those living in remote regions where access to markets was limited. Whiskey was the lifeblood of these communities, fueling not only social life but also the economy. Barter and trade often revolved around whiskey. It was portable, storable, and profitable, an ideal product for frontier life. But in 1791, the newly formed federal government, led by President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, imposed an excise tax on whiskey. The federal government, still in its infancy, was struggling to pay off war debts from the American Revolution. Hamilton, eager to stabilize the nation's finances, saw the whiskey tax as a critical means to generate revenue. Yet to many of these farmers, especially in rural areas, this tax was a crushing blow. They felt betrayed by a government that seemed distant, out of touch with their struggles. Many of these people had fought in the Revolution just a decade earlier, believing they were fighting against unjust taxation and central control. Now they were faced with what felt like the same injustice from their own leaders. The whiskey tax quickly became a flashpoint of discontent. Farmers viewed it not just as a financial burden, but as an attack on their independence and livelihood. For them, it was more than just about whiskey. It was about who held the power and control in this new nation. Resistance spread like wildfire, with farmers organizing protests and forming groups determined to resist the tax. Tax collectors, often seen as the face of the distant federal government, bore the brunt of the farmers' anger. Intimidation tactics became commonplace, with some collectors being threatened, harassed, and even physically attacked. One infamous incident, a federal tax collector was tarred and feathered by angry farmers, a vivid symbol of defiance that harkened back to the days of revolutionary protest. As tensions escalated, the rebellion began to take shape. By 1794, groups like the Whiskey Boys had formed, organizing armed resistance to federal law. They saw themselves as the true protectors of liberty, fighting not just against a tax, but against the imposition of federal authority over their daily lives. To these men, the federal government was no different than the British crown they had rebelled against years before. Their defiance wasn't just about money, it was about the principles of self-governance and local control. They believed they had fought a war for these freedoms and were not willing to give them up. By the summer of 1794, the situation had spiraled out of control. Farmers in western Pennsylvania began to openly revolt, burning down buildings, attacking officials, and threatening more violence. It wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was a national crisis. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, President Washington convened his cabinet to discuss a response. To Washington, this was not merely a dispute over taxes. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government. If the rebellion was allowed to succeed, it could set a dangerous precedent for future insurrections. After much deliberation, Washington made the unprecedented decision to lead a militia force against the rebels. In a show of federal power, he called upon the governors of surrounding states to contribute troops. Soon, a force of over 13,000 soldiers, the largest force Washington had commanded since the Revolution, began marching toward western Pennsylvania. The sight of the massive militia advancing on their towns was enough to cause many rebels to rethink their actions. Though they had been defiant in the face of tax collectors, the presence of thousands of well-armed federal troops presented a very different threat. The rebels, knowing they were outgunned and outnumbered, began to disperse. What could have been a bloody confrontation turned into a peaceful resolution as Washington's forces moved in with little resistance. Despite fears of a violent clash, no major battle took place. Many of the leaders of the rebellion either fled or were arrested, and the military presence quickly restored order. In the aftermath, Washington emphasized the importance of law and order. His decision to deploy military force set a crucial precedent. The federal government would not hesitate to use its power to enforce the law. Though many of the rebels were pardoned, the message was clear. Rebellion against the authority of the federal government would not be tolerated. Though some of the leaders faced trials, most of the participants were eventually granted amnesty. But the symbolic victory for the federal government was undeniable. The Whiskey Rebellion had tested the strength of the young nation's government, and the government had passed that test. Today, the Whiskey Rebellion is remembered as one of the first great tests of federal authority in the United States. It served as a defining moment in the early years of the Republic, establishing the government's right to impose and enforce laws, even in the face of widespread opposition. The legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion can still be felt in modern debates over taxation, representation, and the balance of power between local communities and the federal government. It is a reminder that the story of governance is often a story of conflict, and that the quest for liberty, though noble, is never without struggle. The Whiskey Rebellion underscores the complex relationship between a government and its citizens. It reveals that the fight for freedom is never straightforward, and that the governance of a nation will always involve finding the delicate balance between authority and liberty. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most turbulent moments in early American history. Until next time, remember, the stories of our past continue to shape our present.